In terms of company formation, I mean, the optimal sort of founding catalyst for a company is not a founder thinking something is a good idea or a good opportunity. It's a founder being sort of borderline psychotically obsessed with changing something fundamental about how the world works. It's not that you can't be successful in other frameworks for starting a company, but I do think that is the highest probability in terms of magnitude of success.
Welcome back to another episode of Good Work. I'm your host, Barrett Brooks, and this is a show made up of long-form interviews with talented people who are using their careers to make the world a better place. My guest today is a guy named Ryan Delk. He's one of my best friends of all time. I've known him for over a decade. He's also a multi-time startup operator who's been in Silicon Valley since he was practically 12. I think he actually got there when he was something like 19. But he's got a wealth of experience in startups. He's been in the Bay Area for a long time. He's an investor, and his latest company is probably his most meaningful project yet. It's a company called Primer, and he's working to reinvent the education system using principles from homeschooling and microschooling, combining that with technology to produce incredible outcomes for both students and teachers at the front of the classroom. We talk about his journey through startups, the influences on his life early on, and how all of that adds up to building something meaningful with his current company and with his investment portfolio. I hope you enjoy this conversation with my friend Ryan Delk. Let's get to it. All right, Ryan Delk, one of my best friends in the world. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, man.
Yeah, excited to do it. We've had it on the calendar for a while, but you're one of the ones where it's like this interesting crossover between you're a known quantity in the world and someone that people deeply respect. And you're also just a dear friend. So I know, I have so much context for your life and you have so much for mine that it just makes it joyful to get together. So there's like 1,000 different ways that I thought about starting this conversation, but I thought we'd just go with a fun one, which was actually this year, I think early in January, you retweeted a thing that was a prank that your team played on you 5 years ago, which was wild to think. It's like, golly, I can't even believe you've been doing this for 5 years. But anyways, in 2019, you showed up to your desk after the holiday break and your team had converted the desk to a frozen banana stand. And I'm just trying to imagine the conditions within a culture of a team that would lead a team to make the CEO's desk a frozen banana stand. And I wonder if you'd tell the story.
So this is my last company, Omni, and we had a very strong culture of pranks. And so our head of biz ops, this woman named Beck, who is amazing. We had sort of always had this culture, and then she joined, and it was like, she was like the LeBron James of pranks. And so one time she rebuilt someone's entire desk in Legos, like the entire thing, like replaced the desk one for one with all their stuff. But like the whole desk was rebuilt with Legos and was like structurally sound, like they could like work off their desk. Rebuilt the chair, everything. And so there was just a number of these just like insane, just totally, out of control pranks. We had an intern that we had dug up, had like entered this Taylor Swift contest and tried to meet Taylor Swift and had like posted all these like very cringy things about Taylor Swift onto Reddit. And she dug them up and then she printed them out and she made like a mural above their desk of all these things that they had posted like, 9 years ago about trying to meet Taylor Swift. So she was just always taking it to 11. And her thing was basically always after like a break, she would like try to prank someone. So if they went on vacation or something, she would like want them to come back to their desk and be pranked. And so I had heard rumblings that she was planning something. And so I got back, it was like, January 2nd or whatever. I walked in and I'm a huge Arrested Development fan. And the team knew that. And so they had converted my desk into the blue frozen banana stand from Arrested Development. And the level of detail, they had sourced a Go Bias coffee mug that I still have actually in the Primer office and still drink coffee out of it almost every day. They had like money lining the walls. It was like a double layered thing. So you could remove the walls and then see all the money that was lining it. And apparently it was like basically exactly to scale, like 1/3 scale down to like the inch of how it was in the show. And so, yeah, it was for better or worse, like all my companies, the culture has been very like, there's a lot of intensity, but there's like some level of lightness that people bring in these kind of things. And so, yeah, I think that was probably the best that anyone's ever gotten me, was walking in and seeing that.
I would say you're probably known for your intensity. as much as anything, and not in a negative way. And just like you're focused, you're a focused person, you know what you want to achieve, you have big vision, you know that when you show up to work, like you're there for a reason. And so I love these little glimpses you give of like the fun side, the playful side, the adventurous side of Ryan, and the way that plays out in the cultures of the teams that you lead. So I think it just gives this like full picture of you as a human being, beyond like sitting in the CEO or the COO seat. So I thought that would be a fun place to start.
Well, I think when you spend all this time, if you're like truly going to war with people and you're spending all this time, I think it is a very healthy release valve on the team. It doesn't have to be pranks, but some sort of, if you're going at it 10, 12 hours a day, late nights, weekends, like you get to know each other really well. And you, in my opinion, like as you get to know people well, that you channel that somewhere. And I think a very healthy way to channel that is through some version of something like this, where you have these elements of the culture that are, either funny or inside jokes or whatever. And I think it helps the intense moments, and you actually see this, like there's all sorts of stories from people that get deployed and then they're, in the military, different, very intense situations where there's like these types of like release valves within the culture. And so I think every company is different, but I think having them is very important. And also is like, you look back on it very fondly when you're, a few years removed from it.
Yeah, for sure. And such a positive and powerful alternative to, we could both tell, I'm sure, plenty of stories about companies that we've heard of that have very different ways of letting off steam and habits that they build as teams. So we won't get way off there yet. Anyways, one of the things I love to do with guests when they come on is talk about some of the things, the experiences, the like major moments in their lives that shaped them into the person capable of tackling the kinds of problems that they tackle or doing the kind of work that they do. The one that I wanted to start with you was you made this decision to leave college and move to the Bay Area really early on in your life. I know that you had support structures and like family and everything that were in your corner, but all things considered, you basically shipped across the country alone to a new place, taking a big risk on a career move that meant you were leaving behind like the traditional path of getting a degree and doing all the things that everyone expects of you. So I wonder if you could just take us back to that moment, maybe even the actual moment of deciding, and just kind of share like what was going on in your head, the emotions of it, and how you ended up deciding to go out to the Bay Area and, make the beginning of what's become a long run in tech and the startup world.
I think there's like sort of three inputs to it. The first was, so freshman year of college, I went to the University of Florida. Freshman year of college, I did an internship at a bank, basically doing like underwriting small business loans, like $10 million loans for local businesses. And I thought I wanted to go into finance and I was going to go to Wall Street and go the sort of hedge fund, private equity, iBanking, whatever route. I thought I was going to go that route. And then most of those banks don't really hire. You can't really get good internships freshman year. So I figured I'd do something at like a kind of a smaller thing. And then I would, go do something bigger the next couple internships. But I did that and I hated it. I was like, there's very little agency. This is sort of like a defined system. The rules are defined. You're basically judged by how well you can operate within that system. And it was also very clear that it was not a meritocracy. There was hierarchy and levels. And I was like, there was like super talented people that were 26 years old that were still like very junior because they just hadn't put in the 15 years you need to make, partner or MD or whatever. And so that really turned me off. And so the next summer I went to Nairobi and I emailed this guy, Eric Hirschman, who's still a dear friend to this day, who I knew sort of through like mutual friends at our church. And I just said, hey, you're in Nairobi doing stuff in tech. Can I come out for the summer and just like help you with whatever you need? And that ended up being a very pivotal moment for me because I got there and it was the first time kind of doing something pretty risky. I didn't know anybody besides him. I just got on a plane to Nairobi at 19 years old. And it was amazing. And I sort of got my first taste of what operating in a meritocracy is like, because his culture and all the organizations that he started there was just like, hey, if you can come crush it, like come crush it. I don't care how old you are. And so he gave me huge projects to run. We raised a venture fund. We put on like basically like the TechCrunch Disruptive Africa. And I was like leading these, big parts of these projects at 19. And it was the first time I'd ever felt like someone gave me responsibility that I felt like I had earned or could do, but they didn't really care how old I was. They were just like, hey, if you're competent, you can go do it. And so I ended up meeting a lot of people from San Francisco actually came out to Nairobi that summer. So like Tim Ferriss came out, Marissa Mayer came out when she was still at Google. And so these people, I ended up meeting them and learning more about San Francisco and Silicon Valley through them. And then they ended up making intros and connecting me to people in San Francisco. And so that was actually going to Nairobi was actually sort of the roundabout way that I ended up getting interested in sort of being in startups, because it was my first taste of what operating in a meritocracy was like. And so The next summer, I applied for a bunch of internships out here. And the two that I was deciding between, so I was working for Square while I was at school. And so I was deciding between going to Square for an internship, going to Gumroad for an internship, which was at that point, it was like a 3-person company or 2-person company. I know it was very small. Sahil just launched it, or going to Intuit for an internship. And Intuit was like by far the highest paying. And I remember like flying out and they like got a limo for the interns. And it was like this, they're trying to like, sort of wine and dine everyone. And I was sitting in my backyard with my then girlfriend, now wife. And we were talking and she was like, I think you should just do like the riskiest thing, like whatever the riskiest thing is. And I was like, well, the riskiest thing would definitely be going to Gumroad. Like there's no status, no one knows this company, but I'd probably be able to like learn a lot more there. And I'd probably be able to have a much bigger impact. And so I ended up going to Gumroad, and I was just going as an intern. I wasn't going to drop out. And then at the end of the summer, or halfway through the summer, so that was kind of the second pivotal moment. And then the third pivotal moment was at the end of the summer when Sahil said, hey, would you want to drop out and just keep kind of running growth and trying to make this happen with me? I remember calling my parents and saying, hey, what do you think about this? And I was really, really nervous about that conversation because both my parents are really smart. My dad has 2 degrees. Like I had felt like they really valued college. And I had not internalized at that point how much they actually just valued, like they didn't value the signal, they valued the actual substance. And so I had ascribed way too much, like I had assumed they cared a lot about the signal of graduating from college. And so I called them, and my dad, I remember, I will never forget this. My dad basically didn't say anything for like 5 seconds. And he was like, you know what? One of my big regrets is that I don't think you should have ever gone to college anyways. And it was like I felt like such a immediate, one, I felt like super seen and known by him in that moment. 2, it was like super jarring. And I felt like this big weight. It was pure excitement, pure like, you should definitely go do this. I knew in that moment how lucky I was, because a lot of parents would not react that way, because we didn't grow up with a ton of money. They had saved money for our college. They had paid for I think they paid for all of our college for all 3 kids all the way through. And so they made huge investments and huge sacrifices for many years in order to be able to do that. And the fact that they would just, their immediate reaction would just be excitement was like it was probably one of the moments I will always feel like the most seen and most loved. And so that was the third big moment. And then from there, it was just like pedal to the metal. So I flew back to get my stuff, and then it was just like off to the races.
Have you ever talked to your dad about that moment and just like reflected on it together? I mean, I'm even curious of like, what did he mean by that? One of my regrets is that you didn't even need to go to college. Like, what do you take that to mean now looking back on it?
I don't know. I should ask him exactly what he meant by that. But I think how I interpreted it then and how I interpret it now is that what they cared about was outcomes. And so to the extent that college, what they cared about was their kids going on to lead fulfilling lives, doing ambitious work, caring about making the world a better place for other people, being creative, blazing their own path. And to the extent that going to college was a conduit for that, or a necessary, component of that, then great. But it was purely about increasing the odds of that outcome happening, which at least, 10 or whatever, 12 years ago, when I was in college, it did increase the odds of that happening for a lot of people. I think what he was saying was, hey, all I care about is the outcome. And if you've already got the outcome, like, why should you keep, doinking around back here doing this stuff? And he could tell that I was really excited and that I loved the work. I think I did not internalize how outcome oriented they were, even though they said it. Like I remember they told us this thing when I was a teenager and I was, going through all the normal teenage, angst and tension with parents. My parents, I think my dad or my mom said this thing to me where they're like, we don't care what you're like at 13. We care what you're like at 23 and 33 and 43. And so like, we're only optimizing for like you as an adult. And so all this stuff in between is just noise. Like we want you to lead a fulfilling, emotionally balanced, ambitious, intense, whatever life you want. Then, and this stuff in between, we're optimizing for that. And I think I had not fully internalized that. And really this was even though those conversations were like 10 years apart or 8 years apart, I had not internalized like the connection between those two. And it was really actually very consistent in terms of their parenting worldview.
Yeah. I mean, having a parenting worldview is something that I realize is so rare now. James Clear, our mutual friend, came on the show, and I was so thankful for this. He actually had pulled up his list of principles that he's keeping for parenting. And it's just like a doc in his phone. And he writes down the core principles he thinks he wants to impart to his kids over time. And it's a testing ground, it's like, let me write it down, see how it feels. Like maybe I'll try it a little bit with the kids. And it's just getting refined and refined over time. And I was thinking about how like you've got to be number one, like you got to have certain means, you got to have a certain mindset and education and like enough room to even think about that kind of thing. And like, I don't think my parents did, I just don't think they did. And that's okay. But now to have a group of peers, you, James, basically everyone on the show is the kind of person I would want being around my kids that are thinking about parenting at that level. It's just like this whole different world to me because that's not what I experienced. So it's fascinating for you that like maybe they didn't write down their principles, but they were pretty consistent over time. Your parents were.
Yeah, I feel super lucky on that front.
Ahead of their time in that way. Ahead of their time for sure.
Well, what's interesting is they articulate it as they both grew up in households where they felt like there was very clear right and wrong. There was a right way to do things and a wrong way to do things. There was whole categories of behavior that were just wrong and that you couldn't talk about, you couldn't do, you couldn't show emotion. You had to be very stoic. And so they actually say that they overcorrected is what their articulation would be. Is like, hey, we had this, this childhood experience and we were like, we never want our kids to have that. So we're going to like do this over here. And now they're like, actually, we probably should have like dialed it back and probably helped create some better boundaries. But I think that's part of what happens is like you take your childhood and then you want to basically swing the pendulum to and you interpret it as progress, and it probably is. And then I feel like generational growth at its best is like everyone's swinging the pendulum a little bit, but you're actually like swinging less each time. And then you're like honing in on the actual optimal family culture, parenting, childhood, all those things. If you do have like healthy generational transition in your family and you are building a legacy, then hopefully every generation is healthier than the one before it. And so obviously everyone starts from a different place. I feel very lucky that my parents were pretty intentional, but if your parents weren't, then it's like you're the start of that. And then your kids are going to have a huge leg up in life because of that. And then they're going to probably swing the pendulum themselves. But hopefully it's a little bit less each time.
Yeah. Reminds me of this. I've got so many places I want to go just based on this kind of opening story. It reminds me of this. It was a Christmas Eve family gathering. And I was talking to my uncle, and my uncle is this fascinating guy. He was an air traffic controller for a very long time. And now he lives kind of like in a military retirement town. And he'll do like consulting projects around the world for airports and stuff like that. And so he just gets to interact with a lot of interesting people. He has very deep thoughts and he's willing to have very long conversations about them. And he'll regularly give you an out. He's like, hey man, if I'm talking to you, I'll just feel free to tell me to shut up and I'll go away. But he's doing this one night on Christmas Eve, and I'm talking about the two-party system and how it kind of like feels like it's a little bit broken. And he uses the same pendulum analogy, but at the society level. And he says, look, here's how I've learned to think about the two-party system. There's a pendulum and it swings, and sometimes it swings really wide. And so you go from party to party, back and forth, and it swings really wide. And one party will undo half of what the other party did. But the value in that is the average of the pendulum swings ends up pretty good for most people.
Yeah.
That was the best argument I ever heard for the two-party system. And so it's interesting to kind of hear that on the family level as well, that, yeah, we're reactive on some level to like what we see in the world. And we're trying to balance out the data inputs basically that we're getting and say like, okay, well, what's the next best way to do this in response to that? And but on a generational scale, essentially. So we're not going to get way off into politics yet. We might later. One of the things that always stands out in your story, and that looking back seems obvious that it would have been part of your story now based on what you do, is your parents decided to homeschool you. And so you were part of, at the time, it was basically like a learning group or a pod. I don't remember what they were called at the time, but your mom was kind of a homeschool co-op, and your mom was kind of the ringleader of this. And there are so many things that I wonder if like, okay, I think I see a lot of roots here in what the work you ended up doing. But reflecting back, 20 years later, I wonder what the key ways were that homeschooling experience and having your mom as your teacher and working in a small group of fellow students, how that shaped you as a person and ultimately as an entrepreneur, I guess, being in that environment.
I think one thing I reflect on is why I had such an aversion to banking and the lack of meritocracy is I think that homeschooling at its best is extremely meritocratic, not in like the lateral sense necessarily with like peers or colleagues, although somewhat, but really about how quickly you can progress. Like there's no limit to how fast you can move in homeschooling besides yourself and either your mental faculties or your willingness to work hard or your environment or whatever. I think my parents were just very like it really felt like a treadmill where it was just like, hey, you can go as fast and as long as you want. Like there's no arbitrary gating function. My mom was a teacher. She'd been a public school teacher before she homeschooled us. That was like a huge benefit that we had. And so I think it was the start of this mentality of just like, hey, if I can go fast, or if I want to go do this thing and I believe I can work really hard and do it, like I want to be in an environment where I can go do it. I don't want to be told that I can or that I got to wait or whatever. And so I think that was a huge part of it. And then the other piece is like, they just let us chase what we were interested in. And so, I mean, the secret of homeschooling is like, you really can accomplish most of the core academics in like 2 to 3 hours a day and stay on grade level. And you can get ahead in maybe 2.5 or 3.5 hours a day. And so, because it's so efficient, you're not changing classes, you're not doing the intro and the outro. It's just like, hey, you got to learn math, like go. And so we would have this time in the afternoon where they would just let us do basically like whatever we wanted to do. We couldn't play video games. It had to be like sort of earnest work. Like we had to be working towards something, but they would let us start companies. Like I remember I was like 7 years old and I was building these, stupid little kind of trinkets in my garage, but I had like built up a bunch of inventory. And then every afternoon I would just like walk around to my neighbors and like sell them these, totally useless, ugly things. But I was just like, oh, I'm going to go sell these. And they would buy them for $1 or $2 or whatever. And that was like part of school, was like learning, like, okay, I'm going to go build this thing. I'm going to go then see if anyone wants to buy it. And then I'm going to go sell it. And that was like a thing that they encouraged us to do, start doing lemonade stands, like all sorts of stuff that was like my mom and dad both like really viewed as like part of our education that would not be traditionally considered that, especially not then when homeschooling, there was probably like 5,000 or 10,000 homeschoolers in the state of Florida when we started homeschooling. So this was like a very contrarian thing. And so it was very oriented, like whatever we were interested in. My brother was really interested in creativity and art and different types of creation. And so like he would just spend a bunch of time on that. So for me, that was business, and that was, starting companies and doing things. And so I think like being in an environment very early on where they encouraged me to learn about those things, learn how to do them well, it set me up for being comfortable operating in very high agency environments and being frustrated not being in a high agency environment, which I think is a huge advantage in life. And then having a lot of the just early reps on trying to make money and learning how to build businesses at a very, very basic elementary level that I was able to do as part of my education that traditionally would have only been able to happen on the weekends or in the afternoons of traditional school.
I listened to you in other interviews and you talk about things like your mom laying out, here's what all of 6th grade math looks like, or whatever the grade was.
Yeah.
There's all the concepts you have to learn. You can go as fast as you want. So have at it. You and our other friend, Nathan, who I worked with for a long time, have that in common, where I think somehow you all figured out that system. And it was like, okay, I understand. There are requirements I have to meet. And as soon as I meet them, I can move on. And there's so many parallels now to Primer and like how that I think has probably shaped the way you are designing education for kids today. But it runs so contrary to like the bank. Or I started my career in management consulting. And I remember having a lunch with a partner. And I sat down with this partner. I think it was like 4 months in when the first review cycle came around. And I'm like, well, I'm going to submit my review. I feel like I've done a great job my first 4 months. I want a promotion, which some of that is like youthful ignorance. However, they did bump me up a level based on my like, here's what I've done already. So I sit down with a partner shortly after that for lunch. And I'm like in a suburb of Atlanta working at GE Energy on this horrible project. And I'm talking to this guy and I'm like, okay, how does it work? Like, how do I get promoted as fast as possible? And he's like, it doesn't work like that. And I'm like, no. Just tell me what I have to do. Like, give me this is the 6th grade math, like concepts. I'll do them as fast as I can. We'll get this thing rolling. And he's like, no, the next promotion takes 2 years. And I'm like, yes, except for give me the version that's not 2 years. Right. And he just
want to compress it into 6 months.
Right, exactly. And he's like, no, it's 2 years. And that was the day I knew I was going to quit that job because I was like, I can't do it that way. It reminds me of school. It reminds me of sitting in class and waiting for everyone to catch up. It's like, I want to be in a world and work in a place where you tell me what the requirements are and I meet the requirements as fast as I can. And then we both get better together. That is basically what y'all are building at Primer now, is giving kids runway and saying like, look, here's different pacing. You go figure out, or you tell us what you want to do in terms of that pacing. So anyways, I wonder if just like, if that's conscious or if it's just inherent in the way that you're designing Primer, how many parallels there are between that early experience and what you're doing now.
It's not conscious in the sense that I'm like spending my time brainstorming what my childhood was like and then being like, okay, how do I go build that? But it is conscious, or maybe not quite conscious, but it's heavily inspired in that homeschooling done well is, in my opinion, obviously the best form of education for kids. We're homeschooling our kids. Like it is incredible. There's all sorts of structural barriers for why homeschooling won't work for the majority of, especially in the US, K through 12 students. You have to have, basically requires a 2-parent household, which is increasingly rare. It requires a one parent who's able to stay home with the kids, even if you do have a 2-parent household, which means one parent doesn't work, which is increasingly rare. It requires the parent that doesn't work to want to and have a proclivity towards education and want to educating their kids. And so there's all sorts of just, it's like a tree of eliminations that sort of like filter down the number of families that can actually do it. And so one of the ways I think about Primer is that it's basically a productized, the best of homeschooling, this high agency experience for kids where they get a bunch of time to go deep on things they're passionate about. They can move as fast as they want through core academics. It's productizing the best of homeschooling, but doing it in a way that still meets the needs of the median American family, which is an affordable education that doesn't break the bank, and doing it in a way where it still provides the hey, you can drop your child off for 8 hours a day while you go to work, and we'll provide that service for you, which is a very under-discussed part of the U.S. education system. And so I think that there are certainly parts of my homeschooling experience that influence Primer. And the 6th grade math thing that you talked about is hilarious, because the other day I was laughing because I realized that I was looking at a Primer student's dashboard, and we literally have a dashboard now where we show you, okay, for whatever grade you're in, here's everything you need to know for math or ELA or whatever. And then we use GPT-4 to basically translate all those standards into something that the kid is interested in. So if we know the kid's interested in Roblox or Minecraft or sewing or painting or whatever, every single standard is then translated into some context on why that's important for them to learn. And then we let them decide how fast they want to go. And they can say they want to work 30 minutes a day or 45 minutes a day or an hour a day or an extra hour on the weekends or whatever. And we showed them where they'll be at the end of the year. And I was laughing because it was literally the productized version 20 years later of what my mom did for me when she handed me the piece of paper and said, hey, I wrote down everything you know for 6th grade math, like go as fast as you want. And now every Primer kid can get that. So I think there are some funny, definitely not coincidences like that, where it does feel like a one-to-one mapping a few decades later, but it's certainly not too conscious or explicit.
Yeah. I mean, I would never accuse you of like trying to recreate your idyllic childhood in the form of a company or anything like that. But even like the afternoon time, the like afternoon exploratory time for kids, and like the parallels there between, you having that, and it's educational, but it's driven by the kid. And it gives a lot of agency to the microschool leader to structure that for them and create some boundaries.
Yep.
And yeah, there's a lot of health there. It's like, it goes back to, it's just fascinating to me that your parents figured some stuff out without maybe like the data to back it up. But now you are able to track the outcome-based data on these things really working at an improved rate for a lot of these kids. Okay, we're going to get into Primer more, but I want to come back to, we kind of started like with that decision to go to San Francisco and leave the godforsaken University of Florida to go out there. And then we went back and we talked about micro school. So the people listening will probably know by now. I went to the University of Georgia. Ryan went to college at the University of Florida. It's one of the few things.
That's not the community college that's like a few miles east of Atlanta.
Exactly. Thank you for that. I'm going to not take the bait, and we're going to continue on. So anyways, we went back, we looked at homeschool, and now I want to come back forward to when you got to San Francisco. And I think from my seat today, you're one of the most connected and respected people in the Bay Area. Now, that's like a big statement to make. Obviously, there's people who are more connected than you or more respected than you or whatever. So I'm not saying like you're the pinnacle, but you're up there. And it's basically been through hard work, but it's been intentional as well. Like you've worked towards building the kind of network and the kind of quality relationships over time that allow you to operate in the way you operate. But back then, I mean, you were starting from nothing. You had this, one person basically that was like your entry point from Nairobi into the startup world. And I wonder if you just take us back to that time. Like, what was your approach to building a network and trying to kind of like make a name for yourself, not in like the fame sense, but in the sense of that is a currency when you're trying to start things that are inherently hard?
There's probably two or three ideas that come up. The first is, I think that for people that want to break into technology or startups, it actually is like way simpler than people think. There's some sort of decay function on people that move out to San Francisco and want to work in startups or want to, join the tech industry or whatever, where actually a really high percentage of them either end up not having the stamina and, bouncing out and wanting more status or more money or whatever. And so they go back to consulting or banking or whatever. Or two, they end up not being high integrity people and they lie about something or don't do what they say they're going to do. Or three, they just don't work really hard and they don't end up generating results. And the reality is that every year, some percentage of the people, if you think about everyone that moves out when you move out to San Francisco or whatever your equivalent of San Francisco is, every year there's going to be some decay function on the percentage of people that are going to fall into each of those buckets. I actually think it's like pretty simple. If you come out and you're willing to put in 6, 7, 8, 10 years, whatever it is, and you work super hard and you create results and you are a high integrity person and you tell people you're going to do things and then you do it and you do that over and over and over and over again. And you're willing to take risks and, go work at early companies and sort of delay status for a while. I actually think it's like fairly easy, or I should say fairly simple, not easy. It's not necessarily easy, but it is simple. And that's kind of what I did. Like, it wasn't like I was like employee number one at some crazy rocket ship and like, had this massive win right out of the gate. Gumroad was a slog and it's now, doing well, very profitable, but that was like a slog of a company. My second company, Omni, was a slog of a company. And we went on to have a, small exit, but really it was like just kind of showing up and saying what you're saying, telling people what you're going to do, following through on it. And I remember at Omni one time, I joined Omni and I said, hey, we're building the storage company, but we're eventually going to launch the ability for anyone to rent out their stuff in the Bay Area. And you're never going to need to own items that you only use twice a year again. And I texted that to someone right when I joined. And 3 years later, we launched that feature and she screenshotted that message and she texted it back to me and she said, you're the only person I know that when they texted me this, I actually believed that you were going to pull this off. And I thought that was like an interesting, it wasn't that difficult. It wasn't this crazy thing. We're not putting a, rocket on the moon or something, but, she just believed like, hey, this, you're going to figure this out. The second thing is that, so this is something Chris Sacca told me, who was an investor in Gumroad. When I was talking to him, he said, when you're trying to break into an industry or a network or whatever, always find ways to add value before you ask for value. And I think a lot of people jump to like, hey, can we get coffee? Hey, can I pick your brain? Whatever. And I was just constantly trying to find ways to find something I could do to add value for someone. That was how I approached sales and business development at Gumroad, where I was constantly trying to find ways to help people in some way before we would ask them to use the product. It was how I approached things personally, trying to get allocation to invest in companies. And I think that it's a much slower and it's a much, lower throughput strategy because you can't just send 500 cold emails and just ask people to get coffee with you and hope they say yes out of the goodness of their heart. But the hit rate is much higher and you end up compounding trust at a much quicker rate because you try to do something to sort of help them before you're asking them to do something for you. And so I think those two things are probably the two that stick with me the most in retrospect.
I wonder if you have like a concrete example. I mean, most people listening to this show, they'll have their own method already. Like they will have already done a lot of the same stuff that you or I do naturally. And I don't ask for an example because it's like, here's the formula. I ask for an example almost of like dissecting your brain and how your particular set of skills adds up to building relationships. So if you think back to maybe like building a relationship, you don't have to name the person, but with someone that would have some name recognition, like a specific way that you went about trying to create value for someone in particular, and then how that escalated into a long-standing relationship.
So this was actually before the conversation with Chris about this, but I was trying to get an internship in San Francisco, and Path was a small social network. It was sort of an intimate social network for like your closest 150 friends. That was very hot for a few years and an incredible product that was way ahead of its time. And I was trying to convince them to hire me as an intern. I might be able to find this actually and screen share it if you want. But I emailed Dave Morin, who's the CEO, and Matt Van Horn, who's the head of BD, who's a friend now, and we laugh about this in retrospect. And I talked to them, did an interview, and I literally had zero experience, just like total nobody from the University of Florida. And they emailed me back and they're like, hey, thank you, but like, we're looking for interns that have like an MBA or have like real sort of experience under their belt that are like, in between their first and second year of getting an MBA. And so I was like furious after I got that email. I was like, you got to be kidding me. And so at Square, I had helped them kind of figure out and was one of the first people that worked on this campus rep program for hiring college kids to basically go really just like be a sales force to go like close local merchants in college towns, which have a disproportionately high percentage of like local independent merchants that could use Square. And so I basically took that and mapped it to Path's business. And I felt like if you go, okay, Facebook had this like incredible growth sort of GTM motion around college campuses that was very well documented. I knew, Dave was early Facebook. And so I figured, hey, if I put together a strategy that could work with using a similar strategy to Square, but at Path for getting these pockets of like intimate college networks on Path, that'd probably be something they'd be pretty excited about. And would also demonstrate that I'm trying to really think about the business differently than most jabronis who are going to join this from their first year of Harvard and probably just, not going to be thinking as critically with as much context. And so I put together this very basic Excel model, and which I can try to find if you want, and sent it to him, which is like, hey, I'm basically like, hey, this is something I thought about. I think it'd be an interesting idea. Here's some numbers behind it. Maybe it's something that the other interns that you hire could execute on or someone in the future, but I just wanted to share this because I was thinking about it. And I actually just gotten an offer from Square and Gumroad like a week before this that I was sitting on. And one of them had a deadline. And so I ended up signing that offer. And I like the day after I sent this to them or something. And then 2 days later, I get an email back from Matt, who's like, wait, we got to talk now. Like, this is like, this is an amazing idea. And so I think that was that's a good example of like, I probably should have done that way earlier in the process, but just by putting that together, it totally set you apart from, everyone else who's in the crowd of people trying to work at these hot companies. And it was probably the model was probably terrible. And I probably had really no idea what I was doing. But it showed enough, I think, probably just like, enough activation energy that it was unique enough to put you apart. And like now when people do that to me, I've told this story a few times. And so when people do that to me, when they're applying for internships or jobs at Primer, I always think really positively of it because they're taking the time to go, sort of push the ball forward a little bit before we start the conversation.
This was the thing I always talked about with my team at ConvertKit when I was there. It's like the easiest way to cut out like 50% of applicants for a job opening is just to put any question. It doesn't even matter what the question is, just any question with an open field at the end. That's like, hey, what specifically are you excited about ConvertKit? Like why specifically do you want to work here? It could be that simple. And just half the people won't answer it. You don't even have to read them. It's just like, okay, so we put everyone there away because they're willing to put in so little effort. They didn't even answer the one question that wasn't like just the application. And this is like the antithesis of that, where when you get positive signal in the form of effort before, now granted, that doesn't always translate to after the hiring process. So that's fine. But at a minimum, someone putting that in the hiring process is a positive signal that that's probably a trait that they know how to exercise beyond that. And a lot of people just don't put in that effort. You tweeted this the other day and I appreciated it because it gave a little boost to people looking forward to this show. But you basically said like, hey, I have a friend. He puts in like 15 hours for prep for every podcast episode. And a lot of the guests have said they really enjoy it. It's amazing that sometimes just hard work is the thing that separates you. I don't know what to tell you. Sometimes it's just like putting a little extra effort in really is the thing that differentiates you because people are default lazy.
That's what I think. That's what's so interesting about this is like, I think James responded to this and was like, I don't remember what he said, but something was like, there's still alpha in hard work. And it's a very simple, truism, but I think it's a really profound idea. And I mean, there's like hundreds of thousands of podcasts now. And I've introduced you to several people that have gone on to be on the show. And then they've texted me afterwards and said that was the best interview I've ever done. That was the most prepared, I would be on that show as many times as they want me to be on that show. And they've probably done hundreds of podcast interviews and you have no, podcast right now. You're launching this for the first time and you've already cut above all that noise. And so I think about that a lot. And I think the way James put it, that there's still alpha and hard work it's a very simple but profound idea.
Yeah. Someone the other day, I can't remember who it was. I think his last name is Bateman on Twitter. I'll go back and find it. But anyways, he said something to the effect of like, great research is the process of reading or listening or watching what everyone else has access to and seeing it differently. And I really thought that was interesting that like I will add that layer to it basically, that yes, hard work can like differentiate you from a whole bunch of people. And then you just have to be willing to put your unique spin on it.
Yeah.
The way you lead a company isn't the way I would lead a company. And that doesn't mean either of us are wrong. It means that we just couldn't do it the other way because it would be faking it. It would be faking it to a degree that we couldn't sustain. So there is like this other element of taste or like embracing the way your brain works or whatever. But anyways, I digress a little bit. So I think of your career, for whatever reason, my brain thinks in visuals, and there's like these three big blocks. And so it's Gumroad, Omni, Primer as like the three big blocks. And then underneath, there's like these long-term paths that have been parallel. And one of them is investing. And one of them is like random side projects that you'll get into just for fun, like trading baseball cards, or like you're making a mobile podcast studio right now. And so you've kind of had these like two career paths almost happening simultaneously, where you're building and you're an operator, and then you're also investing and like doing these other things to just explore ideas. We'll get into some of all of that. But the thing I wanted to zoom out on to give people that kind of visual, or the purpose of giving people that visual, is I want to talk about hard problems conceptually, and like why some people get wired to actually try and tackle hard problems and not just go create another software company that can make them, 10 million bucks or whatever. And ironically, how those things end up overlapping. Maybe I'll just start with like a very open-ended, what do you think makes some people want to tackle truly hard problems in the world and not just create a company for the sake of creating a company? And while you're thinking, I just want to read a quote back to you. This was something you tweeted a while back. You said, "Attack hard problems. There are many folks, me included, who will respect you far more for failing in a valiant effort against an important problem than succeeding against an easy problem. We need 1,000x more people attacking our hardest problems." And I just can't agree more. It's like, that's the point of the show, is I want to talk to people who are either doing something at such a high level of excellence. James, as an example, he's reached 20 million people with his book. Or, founders like you, or writers like Packy McCormick or Hannah Ritchie, who are like really trying to drill down on, let's solve the things that fundamentally will improve society if we get them right. We're very aligned on that. So anyways, that's why I'm interested in your thinking on this.
In terms of company formation, I mean, the optimal sort of founding catalyst for a company is not a founder thinking something is a good idea or a good opportunity. It's a founder being sort of borderline psychotically obsessed with changing something fundamental about how the world works. And it's not to say that you can't be successful if that's not true. There's plenty of examples of someone who realized, hey, there's a big opportunity here. Or, hey, there's a platform shift to mobile happening, or AI is going to change everything. And they identify some opportunity and they go build it, and they build a very successful company. So it's not that you can't be successful in other sort of catalyzing frameworks for starting a company. But I do think that is that's the highest probability of success, or maybe more specifically, it's the highest probability in terms of magnitude of success. And so maybe the odds of success are lower, but when you are successful, the magnitude is going to be much higher. And so I think that's the best starting point. And I think the reality is there's a lot of things that's still broken about the world that could be a lot better. And for me, I just find it way more fulfilling to wake up every morning working on something that I believe is truly existential to the future, in this case of the US, but of whatever, whatever version of something being existential you believe. I forget who said this, but it's way easier to recruit really smart people to work on a really, really hard problem than it is to recruit them to work on a mediocrely hard problem, or just like a normally hard problem. And so if you believe that the probability of success and just straight up the enjoyment of building is going to be directly correlated to your ability to attract extremely talented people, then it's actually more optimal to choose a really, really hard problem than choosing just a sort of hard problem. I don't know that necessarily everyone's like thinking through those like rational jumps and then deciding on some hard problem, but education is something that I've thought about for a long time. And so for me, it was just, I viewed this as this is the existential problem to solve. This is upstream of everything, whether you believe that GDP growth is the most important thing for, future US prosperity, or increasing the rate of technological innovation, or the sort of Peter Thiel line of basically you've had this huge stagnation over the last 40 years that it's like a fundamental threat to America that we have to solve. Whether you believe that climate change is the biggest issue, whatever it is, education is upstream. Birth rates, demographic trends, whatever. Education is upstream of all that, and it's a direct input into all those things and thousands more. And so I mean, it is insane to me how few ambitious founders we have working on education. Like I've been doing this for 4 years, and it makes no sense to me. And there's plenty of other examples like this. Nuclear energy is another one that's just now, you're starting to see really smart people working on, but was basically dead from a venture-backed startup perspective for many years. So I think for me, it's just this insatiable obsession with changing something fundamental about the world, which for me is the US education system, and then just being willing to wake up every morning and run through whatever wall, is in front of you. But the problem is that it's legitimate brain damage. Like it's not, these things are really hard, and there are days where you wake up and go, God, it would be so much easier if I was just building, some random SaaS app or something. But I think, from a legacy perspective and from how you'll feel about those hours that you put in when you're 75 years old, sitting on a porch, somewhere with your grandkids, I can't imagine anything more fulfilling than, looking back on it and feeling like you really took a swing, successful or not, but hopefully successful at trying to solve some fundamental problem.
Well, we're preaching to the choir, both of us, because we're already aligned on this. So I won't beat it to death. But one of the things that's interesting to me is a lot of people I see take this approach of thinking, okay, what's upstream of education? Well, it would be quality of home life, access to nutrition. It would be disease prevention, infant survival. There's not a lot upstream of education, basically, is my point in all of that. And so, there is some amount of, you have to have a mental model for the world about structurally what drives outcomes. So in this case, it's education. We could talk about, a lot of the effective altruist movement continues to preach, and I agree with, malaria nets, vaccines, the kind of stuff in developing countries where it's just if you don't have that stuff, education doesn't matter. And then if you don't have education, then the other stuff doesn't matter. So anyways, the trend that I see is a lot of times it's experienced operators or founders who are now saying all right, now let's go pick off something huge, something really big, fundamental, structural to society. And increasingly, there's a younger group of founders who start there. And I find that fascinating too. It's if you could start there at 22, that's pretty wild. That takes a level of insight and wisdom. And I wonder why that is. Do you have any insight on that?
Yeah.
Why do you think it is that people are getting started earlier on bigger problems?
The biggest access to a lot of these problems, or the biggest barrier, has been capital. And so there's a new wave of, Keith Boy at Founders Fund, who was the first investor and has backed Primer many times, Joe Lonsdale at VC, Catherine at Andreessen Horowitz, Josh Wolf at Lux. There's a long list of these investors now that are, willing to back founders solving very, very ambitious fundamental problems with long odds of success. Even very green founders that are saying, hey, I've got, a crazy idea, but I really think this could work. And so I think that's one part of it. And a part of what I want to see is, and the reason why I tweeted that thing about, I will respect you more for trying to solve a really ambitious problem and failing than solving a mediocre problem and succeeding. We have a civilizational imperative to make it higher status to go after these hard problems than to make, $10 million working on some, SaaS app with 500 competitors and figuring out some go-to-market hack that lets you sell the company to Salesforce for 30 million 2 years in. And we have to find a way to make it higher status. And so that's what I'm interested in. But the second thing is that I think there is a pattern, which is your point of if you think about the people that have taken really big swings at these fundamental problems, it is often people that made their first money through something that was substantially easier, whether they admit it or not, some enterprise SaaS app, some consumer social app, whatever. And they made, their first chunk of money, whether that was just enough to de-risk, all their future stuff where they didn't need to work again, or if it was truly FU money. And then they went on and they said, okay, now I'm going all in on these big, whether it's space or nuclear or whatever. AI, whatever it is. And so I think part of what's shifting is now it's not just those people that have already made it saying, okay, I don't have much to lose, I'm going to go big now. And it's people, these investors that are willing to actually take a lot of risk on these unproven founders and say, hey, we'll back you solving these huge fundamental problems. And we'll be the first check in with nothing but a slide deck. And we'll help you, try to figure this out. And I think that's what's shifted over the last 5 years. And if that continues, then I'm, and I think it will, then I'm insanely bullish on this sort of next generation of founders and these problems getting solved. But it's really, a lot of credit goes to these investors that were willing to shift, because for a long time, all the returns were made. And on the other side, it was all, everything was all bits. That's where all the returns were happening. And now you got a lot of people that are willing to, back companies either, building in atoms or at least building in real world, like Primer, in ways that was not happening 10 or 15 years ago.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, so it also makes me think about the like systemic element of how the downstream effects of having founders go into higher impact endeavors after they've done. I mean, you and I are great examples. I'm not building something right now, but I mean, like Gumroad, Omni were not civilizational imperatives. ConvertKit was not a civilizational imperative. Like there is good stuff to be done there. Like I think there's a lot of value in people building independent careers doing creative work. Like art has a place in society, but it's not abundant, cheap, clean energy. It's not restoring ecosystems around the planet. It's not reinventing education. It's not onshoring manufacturing for the modern era. It's not eliminating shitty jobs through AI that then people can go do higher level work. It's like, we just know that's not what it is. And that's fine. And we already did that chapter, right? And so now it's like this podcast, part of the point is let's talk to people doing these things. Let's create more role models. And so that's a systemic piece I think here maybe is like, as you get these experienced people, Ryan X at Flexport, the founders of Helion, the founders of Hadrian, the Anduril founders, they're becoming who we hold up as like, oh, these people are the shit. Like this is who we're looking to as the role models. And so if you are 22, who are you looking at as a role model today versus 15 years ago? It's like, it was Duck and Jack and like all these guys, because that was the era, that was the software is eating the world era. And now it's like hardware and deep tech is the thing to go do that's actually hard and new frontiers. I think that's really special. And that's like important.
I think a lot of these investors, like Founders Fund and these funds, they get a lot of credit for backing this when it was super unpopular. I think the other thing that's going to happen now is I think there's going to be even more dollars allocated to these kinds of companies because the moats in building, especially like enterprise SaaS, like LLMs are going to change everything. And when you can rebuild, almost any enterprise SaaS app for 1/10 of the cost base and run sales teams and support teams at 1/10 of the cost base, and then all of a sudden go charge, you have a team of 10 that can go compete with a 2,000 person company and, charge 30% less and have the same, charge 70% less and have the same operating margin. That's a problem. And it's a problem for a lot of these, venture funds that have made their, basically their entire careers betting on these kind of companies. And so I think you're going to see a lot more. And I've talked to several GPs at these large funds that historically have backed only software companies that are now saying, okay, we got to figure out either in the current fund or in the next fund, and we're going to bring on partners and we're going to shift our strategy to be backing more of these companies in the real world, because that's actually where the alpha is going to be going forward. Because AI will be an accelerant. Like there's all sorts of ways in which LLMs are going to make those things more efficient and easier and make more things possible. It's an accelerant for it versus like a direct threat. And I think the other side of it is that there will probably still be significant alpha on SaaS, but it will look very different. It'll be smaller teams raising less money that will create very large outcomes, but it'll be harder to deploy hundreds of millions of dollars into these companies. And so I think there's a whole different fund strategy that's happened there. So anyways, I think there's the sort of secular trend that these investors that blazed the trail over the last decade deserve a ton of credit for. And then I think now there will be just a pure capital allocation shift that will push even more money into these kind of companies, because that's where the alpha is going to be. So, we'll see how it plays out, but that's what's exciting for me right now is that I have probably 10x the number of founders reaching out to me trying to solve one of these problems that want help with it than I did, 5 years ago or 4 years ago when I started Primer. So I don't know, it makes me pretty bullish for America and for this next crop of founders.
Yeah, for sure. And just for solving the stuff that both metaphorically and actually keeps me up at night that I feel like we need to solve for. Okay, we're going to take a quick break. When we come back, I want to talk about a few things. I want to talk about some of the areas that I see you being world-class at as an operator: recruiting, growth, culture. I want to talk about our roles as fathers and husbands. And we might even dabble in some religion and politics in a non-confrontational way. So that's what people have to look forward to. But we'll be back in a few minutes.
Hey, it's Barrett. You've reached about the midpoint of this conversation, and while we take a little break for station identification, as they say, I want to tell you about two things. First of all, I write a newsletter every Saturday for founders and creators who are leading teams and companies to make an impact through your work. It has 3 sections in it. The first one is a mini essay from me based on my executive coaching work with founders and creators about how to lead well. It has 3 long-form essays or links from around the web that will help spark new thoughts to help you lead better. And it has 1 quote from a meaningful book that I often find myself recommending to friends and clients. All the feedback I've gotten so far is that it hits exactly on the kinds of issues that founders, CEOs, and creators are facing every day in their work. So if that sounds appealing to you, make sure to go to my website at barrettbrooks.com, and you can subscribe right at the top of the homepage. That's BARRETTBROOKS.com. The second thing I want to tell you about is that my day job, I actually do have a day job, I'm not just a podcaster yet, is as an executive coach, as I just mentioned. I work with founders of Series A startups and later, and with creators who are doing at least $1 million as a solo founder and are now thinking about growing a team. The uniting commonality between the founders and the creators I work with is that you've reached a point in your business where you know you're going to make it. Actually, you're doing quite well. And now the question is, how much do you want to scale? And what are the leadership challenges that you're going to face along the way? This work is based on both my training as a coach and in my work as an operator and growing my old company ConvertKit from $3 to $30 million in annual revenue. If you're a founder or creator who might benefit from coaching, or if you know someone who's looking for a coach, I'd love for you to check out my site and my coaching page at barrettbrooks.com/coaching. You can learn everything about how I work as a coach and also fill out a form to have an exploratory conversation if that sounds interesting to you. All right, that's all I got for you right now. There's no sponsors for the show at the moment, so consider me your sponsor. Let's get back to the conversation for the second half. All right, and we're back. Listeners to the early episodes of this thing are either going to get a really special experience, or it's going to be like there's going to be 3 seconds of a gap between when we come back and we're back, depending on what I do at the middle of the show. But anyways,
You're going to get this is going to be where the ad roll is going to be, or what are you going to do there? Little improv session?
We'll see. I don't know what I want to do at the midpoint. Maybe I'll do a little monologue. Maybe I'll do some ads. Maybe, I don't know. All right, we're back. So, Ryan, you talk a lot. You have talked a lot publicly already about the education system and its brokenness. And so I want to look at it more through the lens of like picking that apart from a founder perspective. There's lots of things we could look at in education, whether it's like the data on reading and math levels being way below where they should be in a lot of the country, absenteeism being super high in most of the public school system, teacher turnover, but more than anything, teachers who want to remain teachers and feel like they have to leave because it's just suffocating them, the layers of bureaucracy and policy and everything. There's a lot of brokenness in the system. So when you started, I guess like when you were done at Omni, and from my seat at least, and I'd love to know if this feels true to you, it was like you were going to be the founder of the next thing, or a co-founder of the next thing. You weren't going to like try and join another team. So when you were zooming out and saying, okay, of all the problems I could tackle, education is, I think, where I want to go. How did you figure out what slice of that you wanted to pick off and try and run at?
I had basically decided before Omni that I was never going to become a founder for the sake of becoming a founder. And so I had a bunch of ideas, but this was the only idea that I was like, okay, this is the thing I could probably work on for the next 10 years. And so either I need to go do this, or I'm going to go join another company as COO or whatever. And so I actually was pretty deep in conversations just as I was exploring with 2 sort of like Series B, Series C stage companies about becoming COO. So I actually wasn't necessarily like, hey, I'm going to become a founder regardless. It was, hey, if the education idea is really the only idea I could see myself working on for a decade. And so, once I got conviction on that, I reached out to a few people, David Sachs, Keith Boy, a bunch of people that I respected and that had been, helpful to me over the years, and just said like, hey, you all been in similar seats, like trying to think through things. And they were super helpful, super useful sounding boards for this. And it was just clear. I think it was clear after those conversations that I had been thinking a lot about my sort of personal passion for education and how much I cared about solving this problem, but I had not thought enough about the recipe for what the founder archetype in order to attack this would be. The Venn diagram of people who had access to raise an adequate amount of capital to attack this, because at least initially you would need to raise substantial capital. It's actually not super capital intensive now from here on out, but the initial capital raise would be, you got to raise tens of millions of dollars to get it off the ground. And then a personal like firsthand experience, ideally also having kids. So both like, experiencing alternative education myself personally and, having kids. And then 3 is, you have to be willing to go to war. This is the incumbents, which we can talk about if you want. The incumbent forces are extremely good at ensuring they remain incumbents. One of our investors said that, the teachers unions make the taxi unions look like child's play. I don't know if I totally agree with that, but, Uber sort of famously had these crazy battles, with the sort of taxi incumbents. And so it was clear to me that, like, if someone was going to do this and actually try to take on the traditional system, you would have to have extremely thick skin, but then be willing to actually like take some punches and some body blows and be able to keep going and run towards them, not away from them. And so the fact that we know each other very, very well, like I'm super energized by like the idea of going to war for something that I care about. Is I can't imagine anything more, exciting to get up in the morning. So the combination of those three things was just clear to me. Okay, this is actually like, not only is it something I'm personally passionate about, but there's actually this whole other side of it that I hadn't really thought through. And that was really the turning point for me, where like, okay, this is the point of no return. Like, I have to go do this. And so I talked to Tori, my wife, and she prayed about it and spent, a few months kind of thinking through it. And then it was just clear, like, hey, this is where I want to go. And so, yeah, that was kind of the original impetus for getting Primer off the ground.
And what made you pick micro schools as the right model for kind of battling the incumbent? And just to like define the incumbent model, I mean, it's basically the public education system, which is large schools built in big structures for hundreds and hundreds of kids to go through in a set curriculum where everyone goes at the same pace for the most part. And it's not working for a lot of students. I mean, it's just not working to create good student outcomes for most students, or for enough students that it's broken, basically. I should define it that way. So how did you pick micro schools as the right way to go about battling that?
One of the challenges in education, well, any business, like OpEx and CapEx are incredibly important parts of the equation, especially if you're going to be raising equity capital to go, do something. And one of the challenges in education, and a lot of people that have tried to do this in the past have sort of tried to compete on the same playing field by the same rules as the traditional system. And so a lot of the efforts have been, which I, have a lot of respect for, and a lot of these founders and think they, fought hard, but they've tried to basically say, we're going to create a marginally better, version of the $50,000 a year private school. And then over time, we're going to try to get the cost down. But we're going to go get the same buildings they get. We're going to go, either buy or lease the $10 million, downtown New York, San Francisco, whatever, buildings. And we're going to try to compete head to head with them on that front. And I always felt like the path from there, that operating model, to actually having, say, 2 million kids in your network, it was so hard to believe that you could do that. Not only just from like a pure, like, okay, how big is the market for these higher end schools, but from a just scaling motion perspective. Like if you require purpose-built real estate, either existing school real estate or, build out real estate of traditional schools for 300, 500, 1,000 students, it's just very, very difficult. It's getting harder every year to build anything in this country. And, real estate's getting more expensive, zoning's getting crazy, all these things. And so the idea that you would ever make a real dent on getting, 2, 3, 5, 10% of the US K through 12 students into the system, which is, in my opinion, like the only measure of success if you want to bend the outcome, for humanity and for the United States, is getting a substantial number of these students into the system that can generate better outcomes. It was just so hard for me to believe that was possible. And so micro schools to me were this incredible structural advantage where you can launch a school for in the low tens of thousands of dollars. You can basically build it entirely in an asset light real estate model where you can use existing churches, libraries, community centers that are already built out to have 20, 30, 40 students, whatever, in the space. And you can acquire these spaces really easily. Like a micro school leader can go talk to a church or talk to a community center and say, hey, I want to start my own school. Could I rent this space from you? And, you're talking about single digit thousands of dollars a year, sometimes, in rent, like very, very cheap. And so there's huge advantage from an operations perspective. And then from a market perspective, it also allows you to put the schools right in the neighborhoods where the kids are, because these spaces exist in these neighborhoods. And if you're reliant on actually building a whole new school building or using a traditional school, the number of potential real estate options, in a given town might be like 30 or 40 total. Versus if we are looking at a, new city that a micro school leader wants to launch a school in, we literally have hundreds or in some cases thousands of potential real estate options. And so to me, the structural advantage of micro schools was just so great that it was obvious to me that this was the shot, and it would allow you to compete on a different playing field than the traditional system. And it gave you the best chance, I think, at getting 5 million kids, into the system over a 10 or 15 year period, which is the benchmark of success for us.
And so to arrive at that model, was that how you were using those conversations with like David Sachs or Keith Boy or like fellow founders? Were you like getting at a whiteboard or having coffee and chatting through like, okay, structurally, what's our entry point here? And how do we pick the best way to go about this that gives us the most upside for impact? Like, how were you getting at that concept to begin with? Because it seems obvious right now, and you've got a great story around it, but like, how did you arrive at it?
Those were much more, should I do like binary, should I do this conversations? They were less tactical. Yeah, most of this came from actually exploring the market and trying to figure out, okay, where is the entry point and what is how do I find a different playing field to compete on? And specifically, how do I figure out how to do this? Where really like the equation in my head was, how do I decrease the friction per new student that can join the network? How do I make the friction defined as like time, from the team's time, from the teacher's perspective, money from our perspective, from the teacher's perspective. How do I decrease that friction as far as possible? And what model allows you to do that? And once we sort of discovered this, it was hard to imagine. I mean, I literally cannot imagine a model that would be easier, lower friction to scale than this.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the interesting trends that I'm starting to see in a lot of the founders that either I research or interview or just like am inspired by is the amount of intellectual understanding they have for the space that they operate in, like how deep they go on understanding the mechanics of how their industry works so that they can arrive at the first principles, basically, of like what here is broken that doesn't have to be. And how do we make that the central point of our competitive advantage? But it takes so much effort to get to the level of understanding, like the fundamental layer of understanding required to then say, now I get it. Now I see the entry point. And I think more founders would be well served, not to like analysis paralyze their way into years and years of not doing anything, but to really sit with other smart people or even just themselves and like research and think through the mechanics of what they're trying to get done and what the right entry point is for their mission. It doesn't happen often enough. And I think for the truly high level operators, that's where they begin.
Yeah. And that's where it goes back to like, is the catalyst for starting the company, like wanting to change something fundamental about the world, or is it wanting to start a company here? And if it's changing something fundamental about the world, you're going to spend a lot more time. And in fact, I wish I had spent more time actually on this. It would have saved myself a lot of headaches and mistakes. But if you're trying to change something fundamental about the world, you're going to be inherently more interested in what are the physics of actually making that happen versus if you're just like, hey, I see an opportunity here and I'm going to go because I want to start a company and be a founder.
You bring up the union thing and I don't want to harp on it, but it's interesting to me that, the origin of unions, I think were very admirable. There were like really, really bad conditions for working people in the world when unions got started. It's like people were dying at machines and all of this kind of thing. And so I think there's an admirable cause and mission behind where unions came from and like the altruistic and generous view of why they got started. And now it's interesting to me to look at something like teachers unions fighting things like Primer, because if you look at the fundamentals of like a teacher's experience within the existing system versus a teacher's experience at Primer, they get paid more, they still have benefits, they get to be entrepreneurial, they have autonomy and agency over how they structure their days, how they help kids learn, the outcomes for the students are better, so they're more mission aligned. It's like just objectively, if you look at what's happening for a teacher in one system and that same person in the Primer system, I don't understand the argument. And so that makes my relationship to the efforts of the teachers union in fighting something like Primer very complicated, because it's like, I don't really understand if the objective is to advocate for teachers and their well-being and their careers, why would you fight a thing that objectively on paper is giving them a better career? I don't fully understand that. I just wonder, like, is that part of what motivates you, or like, how do you think about that?
I think they've been so ideologically captured by, I think this is true of a lot of them. Like we're so far past the majority of the work or the efforts being about creating, safe working conditions or things like that. It's hard to even, use the same term to describe what's happening today versus what was happening when, you had people dying at machines and factories or whatever. So yeah, it's the ideological inconsistencies they're rampant. And if you're evaluating it rationally, it totally makes sense, but it's not. Almost all of the major ones are much more about maintaining an industry or a status quo for a select group of people and ensuring that the incumbents stay in power than they are about, sort of under this guise of equity and, fair working conditions and whatever. I often think about when I see something about like, Google employees unionizing or something, like I think about like some like coal miner in, I don't know, West Virginia or something, like their dad like formed a union because everyone had cancer and was dying at like 46 or something, like reading about like Google employees unionizing and just like what would their reaction to that be and how what would they think about that? There totally are, like I completely agree with you. They're totally the origins of unions, like there are plenty of examples where they were clearly net beneficial to society and very important. But I think the teachers unions just honestly, they way overplayed their hand during COVID, and it became explicitly ideological in a way that became obvious to a lot of parents. And I think it's just very hard to recover from when you erode that much trust. And I don't think they will recover from it, frankly.
Yeah, it comes back to this idea that's come up on the show before of maximalism often having negative externalities more than positive. And that you could apply that to any number of things, whether it's unions, whether it's like nonprofits who end up like they're founded to try and solve a thing, and then they continue operating, and they kind of like lose their way and actually trying to solve the underlying problem, whether it's government and it expanding to the point where it's no longer effective, or whether it's big business and it losing its way and like maximalizing the profit motive to the point that it creates so many negative externalities that it's no longer serving the communities that it was originally in business to serve. And this is just a perfect example of it, I think, where maybe someone can make a really intellectually honest, logical argument for why it matters to fight primer, but it's hard for me to imagine it. So we don't need to spend a ton of time there, but I just thought it was an interesting point that I don't know, I didn't want to leave it.
Yeah.
On the other side of that, it's like, so that creates a lot of policy battles, and it creates a lot of things that you all have to do to create an environment where you're even allowed to operate. I mean, that's like the fundamental challenge that comes out of that. And that's that competitive streak in you that I know gets you fired up, that I know makes you excited to like go advocate for this mission, for the kids, for the teachers, and like make it happen. The other side of it, this is always where I'm like pushing you, is the heart-centered piece of it. And there's two big elements of this that I think I see in you that I just want to check them with you on. One is you've got this model of teachers, or this motto of teachers as superheroes. And I don't imagine this is explicit, but I wonder how much of that belief was ingrained from an early age, seeing the work your mom was putting into educating you and the other kids in your co-op. And like, if there's any roots of that teachers as superheroes thing, that's also like, man, my mom was like a superhero for our little community.
Yeah, it's definitely rooted in that. And also I think when I see people that I feel like are underappreciated in society or low status in a way that doesn't make sense to me, I almost have a uncontrollable desire to like right that wrong. And this is like one of those that exists in primer, where like, I talk to teachers all the time that we interview that are like, yeah, I've like been, I spent all Saturday like helping the student that like is behind, and, they don't have a dad and their mom's, in and on and off the streets. And I'm just like, really want to help them. They're 4 grade levels behind in math, and I really want to help them. And I'm like, that's literally, we are like so lucky as a society that you are willing to do this for like $55,000 a year and spend your weekend on these things. Like, we're just incredibly lucky that you happen to be altruistically motivated and willing to spend your free time doing this. And there's hundreds of thousands or millions of those stories that happen every year. I think just the whole incentive structure of the existing system is totally broken. And so, I mean, we basically help. I mean, one articulation of it is like we help teachers become entrepreneurs and launch their own schools. And so, not only is it really great marketing, but it's also what I believe when I say that teachers are superheroes. And when you sort of fully peel back all the bureaucracy and the administrative layers that hold them back and all the paperwork, and you say, hey, you can go, do your thing, they create insane outcomes for kids, and the families love it and the kids love it. Like, so to me, it's just like obvious. And I think teachers are really underappreciated in society. And part of what I hope primer can do over the next decade is make teaching really, really high status, where not just a primer, but obviously, hopefully a primer being a big part of it, that if you become a teacher and you launch a micro school, or you become a teacher at your local school, like that becomes higher status and something that people view a lot more favorably, and not like a fallback career or, a lower status career. because education is upstream of all these very important problems. And it's very hard for me to imagine a world where we substantially improve education without making teaching higher status. It might be possible, but I've not come across a compelling argument how you could make some massive leap forward in the quality of education in the US and teaching not somehow become a higher status thing as part of that.
Yeah. And the other side of that is the kids, right? And the kids are ultimately the beneficiaries of all of this. The teachers having better jobs and more autonomy to serve, the technology enablement that y'all have, the like trusting kids to set their own goals and to be ambitious and to like be intelligent. I think that's one of y'all's mottos as well, something like trust the kids or like believe in the kids.
Take kids seriously. Yeah.
Yeah. Take kids seriously. There's this quote on, you've got this pinned tweet thread about Primer. And there's this quote from parents, and I'm using this one because I know it's public, right? And like we talk about some of the stories that you see and the kids and the parents, but this one is public. And so I'll just share it real quick. Primer has been an answer to a prayer. He's so much happier when I pick him up, never complains about his day or people at school like he did previously. I've heard from neighbors who are also Primer parents that the children wake up on weekends excited thinking it's a school day. Apparently they can't wait to get back to school. This honestly speaks volumes to me. This is a fairly innocuous one relative to a lot of the stuff that I think y'all get in terms of testimonials and like the level of how personal education is in terms of the impacts on individual students, their hopes and dreams for their lives, their experience within their families, the like possibilities it opens up for future generations where, yeah, it might be a single parent working 12 hours, 14 hours, 16 hours a day and like hoping that their kid will have a better opportunity. I wonder if you could just speak to the heart of like the impact that has on you knowing these individual stories of the children that have better lives because of the schools that you run.
Startups are insanely hard. Every startup's hard. Primer is exceptionally hard. It's the hardest thing I've ever done. But I'm in the schools with students multiple times a month, and talking to users is like a sort of like startup colloquialism that's important, and it's always motivating, I think, regardless of, what you're building. But when your customers or your users are, ambitious 12-year-olds who are super pumped to be at school and working on these crazy projects. I was down in one of our Miami micro schools, and I walked into like the backyard area of one of the micro schools that all the kids were like playing soccer. One of them ran up to me and was so excited to tell me that they had just for the first time, they had beat their goal in reading. So every 5 weeks, kids set goals for where they want to be at the end of the 5 weeks. And for the first time, this kid came in, couldn't read at all in first grade. And for the first time, he had beat his goal. And he told me, and then every other student started telling me where they were on their goals. And they didn't have their laptops out. They were playing soccer. So this was all just like they had internalized this in first, second, third grade. It was like so ingrained in them, like this goal setting exercise, that they knew exactly where they were. They didn't have to check. And seeing a kid who's extremely, it's not a high schooler, this is a 6-year-old or a 7-year-old that has internalized like, hey, I can set a goal. I can work extremely hard. I know this will have, an impact on my education, my ability to progress through my education, who, comes from very challenging family environment. I walked out of that, I spent maybe 20 minutes there and got back in an Uber and went to my next meeting. And you could run through a wall after that. Like all the stuff, all the legislative fights and the incumbents and all the things that are hard about it just fade away. And you're like, I will do it. I will do anything, to keep building this company and to be able to make this happen for hopefully hundreds of thousands and millions more kids like him. And so, we encourage everyone on the team, whether you're a software engineer or designer or operations, anything, to really spend time with parents and the micro school leaders and the kids as much as you can, because it is just unbelievably inspiring and energizing. It's very, very difficult. You can read an anecdote like that and it hits you and you're like, wow, that's a really powerful sentiment. But when that parent tells you that through tears or gives you a hug at pickup and says, I'm so thankful that I found Primer, or the kids tell you themselves, like it just hits on a totally different level. And I think with how hard startups are, like having that, as sort of a consistent feedback loop and motivation is just incredibly powerful. And I honestly think like with how hard Primer is, if we didn't have that, we might have been done a long time ago, because it's just such an intense, it almost feels like a performance enhancing drug or something to be able to have these conversations, because you feel so motivated afterwards because the impact is so real on these families.
Yeah, I've got some of my own parallel experiences. I was on the board of a nonprofit in Atlanta for a number of years called Camp Horizon that worked with abused and neglected children in the foster care system. And yeah, you hear those individual stories, and the one other story I'll share related to that is that for one summer, I coached travel baseball. We both grew up playing baseball. It was an 11-year-old team. Any of my friends, you would be one of the best people to say this. Like if you were giving a kind of like funny introduction of me, you'd be like, yeah, he's like naively altruistic, but he comes by it honestly. And like, you'll think that he's kind of a loser because of that. But then if you get to know him, you realize, no, it's just like actually how he is. That's how I was as a coach. It's just like building the kids up.
Impression.
So one of these corny exercises at the beginning of the season, I was like, all right, between now and next practice, I want you to go home. You can talk to your parents, you can talk to your teammates, and I want you to write down on a sheet of paper, what's your goal for the team? What's your goal for you? Like, how do you want to get better as a player? What do you want to achieve as a team? And, universally, it's like every kid says, we want to win the end of year tournament that we travel to Florida for or whatever. Like, okay, this team was not very good. And I'm like, well, it gives you something to shoot for, that's great. But then all of them had their developmental goals. And that's really the more important thing is like, how are you going to get better as a player? So for whatever reason, I think I had, it might've been conflict with this camp that I was at, actually. I couldn't go on the tournament trip. And that was the only game I wasn't at all year, or the only series of games. So they go down to Florida, and the head coach, who was my actual high school baseball coach when I was in high school, he texts me at the end and he says, they fucking won. And I'm like, no, they did not. Stop messing with me. And they won this tournament. They had no business winning this tournament. But these kids were so motivated because they all went around the circle and read their goals at the next practice. And they all realized like, oh, we all want to do the same thing. And man, it sounds so stupid and basic when you say, let kids or let people set their own goals and then just hold them to that. But it works. It's just giving people agency and then the support and not even accountability, just reminding them of their own commitment, how effective that is. It's incredible.
Yeah, even if the things you want them to set goals for are the same. That's the thing that's crazy about primer is like the stuff we want them to set goals for is the same type of academic outcomes you would want in a traditional system where the teacher is setting the goals for them. But the fact that you give them a structure where they set the goals totally transforms the performance and their buy-in on it. And they're making way more progress than they would be if the teacher said, hey, this is your goal. And it was the exact same thing, but the teacher said, hey, this is your goal for, this next 5 weeks. They wouldn't be nearly as bought it. And so it's, I could go on and fist about a long time, but yeah, I think that's like the ultimate, that is like one of the fundamental shifts that we've made that I think is probably the highest ROI cultural shift, cultural difference in primer than the traditional system in terms of what the actual impact is for students.
So I see parallels between that and team culture, actually, because my experience working with people and hiring them and trying to help them be great, I always saw my job as an operator as like, I wanted to help people do the best work of their lives and reach potential they didn't know they had at work. That's a big, lofty thing. It's hard to do. It's hard to unlock for people. Sometimes like people need different things. But pretty consistently, I found that if you find someone who is aligned to the mission, driven like from inside, you make clear the organizational goals and you let them set their own in alignment with that, like that's some of the most effective you can be. So it's very similar actually with people at work. I wonder, number one, have you found that to be true with your teams? And number two, what other kind of core cultural elements have you found for unlocking people's potential and like inherent drive in their work?
Yeah, there actually are a lot of similarities to how we approach like the culture at Primer schools and the culture at Primer, the company. Probably the biggest thing that I focus on is giving people, this is something I learned from Keith Raboy, was giving people, you basically want to constantly increase the responsibility or the scope that someone has. If they've demonstrated competence, you want to constantly increase the scope until they break. And them breaking is totally fine, assuming they're performing well. And then that's the point where you say, okay, we found like the limit and we're going to, dial it back. And I don't mean breaking in terms of like having a, breakdown as a human. I mean, like they dropped the ball on something. They dropped the ball on something for the first time or whatever. And you say, cool, like that's the limit. That's the edge right now. Great. We're going to hang here. And then as you grow, we're going to keep adding more. And so that's one thing that happens across all of Primer, from like micro school leaders to, executives. And then another thing is I care a lot about undiscovered talent. And I think that startups, it's very, very difficult to win at startups, or it's, at a minimum, it's much less capital efficient if you are only hiring people that are known quantities, that already have, check all the boxes on their resume, that are already, big deals in their respective fields. And so I spend a lot of time trying to get very, very good over the last 10 years at attracting, discovering, and closing undiscovered talent. And so of my exec team, my last team, at Omni, all of them are either founders of venture-backed companies now or executives at publicly traded companies, publicly traded tech companies. We have multiple people that I've hired straight out of high school at Primer that have dropped out of high school to join Primer. And part of it is like being in education. I think you sort of naturally attract the sort of younger people that are like, hey, I just got out of that. That sucked. I really want to build a better version of that for like the next generation. And so we do have that advantage. To me, that is like if there's one thing that a founder can get very good at, it's that. Because if you can attract this undiscovered talent, two really important things happen. One is you're able to hire these people before they're known quantities, which has all sorts of benefits for the organization. And then two, you become the place where they became a known quantity. One of the metrics of success for team building for me is how many people can I hire that are not known quantities, that no one really has figured out, hey, this person's insanely talented. And then Primer or any of my companies becomes the place that they then say, yeah, that was actually where I made it. That was where like now I'm a known quantity. And they could go on to start a company or join another company or whatever, but you will forever be the person that, kind of helped put them on the map and gave them the platform and the responsibility and all that. And that's incredibly fulfilling for me. That is, these outside of the vision and the mission of Primer and achieving that is the second most fulfilling part of building companies for me is finding these people that are undiscovered talent and then helping them become extremely successful. The number of people that I've invested in that I hired and they were interns and no one knew who they were and now are, doing these amazing things and building these huge companies. There's probably 10 or 12 of them now at this point over the last 10 years. And that's just, it's incredibly fulfilling. And you also make an impact on these people that's like going to last forever. And so I think that undiscovered talent, that to me, that is still, one of the most important parts of building startups.
Yeah. I mean, I'll add to it that for me, one of the most satisfying was helping people do things at work that they didn't know they were capable of. That like they could take on a project and deliver on it at a level they didn't know if they were going to be able to do. Or that maybe 5 years ago, working under a different boss who was like, didn't invest in them as heavily, wouldn't have tried. The safest thing to do in recruiting is to look for people with brand names on their resume who have done the job that you're hiring for. And something that I found with that is that if someone has been at brand name companies and they've done the job you're hiring for, you are inherently not giving them that edge, that learning edge that we were just talking about. So the other way to go about it is to look for people with high trajectories that haven't yet done the thing that you're hiring for, who are extremely motivated to try and become the kind of person capable of doing that, which is this kind of like undiscovered talent thing, right? And I wonder, well, it's a much more advanced tactic because it's a lot harder. There's not as clear indicators on who's got that potential and like who could be that. So what are you looking for? Like, what are some of those indicators that you're looking for in discovering those people and giving them opportunities?
There's two versions of it. So one is if you're hiring someone straight out of high school, or in some cases, like, we've hired people that are only in their freshman or sophomore year of high school. They don't have a huge track record of work experience. So it's easier if they've had like one job. And the signals that I look for are if they're working for someone that I trust and respect. So they're working for a founder that I think has really good judgment. And very quickly, so within 3 to 6 months, they were put on a project that was like one of the top 5 most important things of the company. And so like, let's say an easy example, someone was, early at Stripe, and within 6 months, they're working on the core payments product out of school. That's an extremely bullish sign. The most important project of the company. Or another example would be like they were put on issuing at Stripe, which was a big bet on issuing new cards. And it was something that was very strategically important to the company. They needed it to work. And so if you got put on that project, that'd be an example of someone having a lot of trust in your abilities at very early on in your career. So that's much easier. And then the second thing I look for is them having some level of progression within that very quickly. And so ideally in the first year, they've gotten promoted at least once or working on more substantial projects. Now that's much harder if they're straight out of high school or they've only done internships or whatever. And for that, I'm much more just looking at raw intellectual horsepower and how hard do I think they're going to work. And if someone is insanely smart and we're going to work insanely hard and believes in your mission, it's really, really difficult for them to fail, especially if they're coming in an IC role. And so you can genuinely tell pretty quickly, like if someone is high intellectual horsepower, you can tell that within 3 to 5 minutes in a conversation. And then if they're going to work hard, you usually can tell in the first conversation, but if not, you can test it, with some sort of work trial type things or, interview process. And if they have those two things, it's an instant. If they're, top 5% on both of those, then it's basically an instant hire for me because it's very, very hard to screw up. Especially if they're not going to be managing people, they're just coming in to own some key thing. They're almost certainly going to be successful.
Yeah. Yeah, and that was going to be my next question is like when you look at execs, hiring an exec is so different from hiring an IC because the competencies required are like worlds apart. And oftentimes being a great IC has no bearing on whether you're a great leader of team.
Yeah.
So what's the added layer? Like what are you looking for when you're hiring execs? Are they already known quantities to you? And so you like have track record, or are there other things?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely with execs, and to some extent with ICs, there's times where you just want to hire the known quantity. I often will look for whatever the inputs of success are for that role. You can often find some version of the undiscovered talent thing where you find them having done done a role with similar outputs and inputs at either a smaller scale or a different industry, or some off the beaten path in some way. And usually that's the best version of, you're not going to find some, college dropout, who's going to be a great COO of a 500 person company from day one. It's just not going to happen. But there's sometimes, sort of a little bit of alpha or arbitrage there. But I think in some cases I think you just want to go get the exact right person. And so there's all sorts of roles where you just want to hire the best recruiting firm and go find the best person. But with execs, I care a lot more about them being a true barrel that you can say, hey, these are the 5 things that are most important things, and you're going to will these into existence with your team, and whatever it takes is going to get done. And I'm trusting you to see around every corner related to these things, to know what the second and third order effects are going to be, and to be in really clear communication with me. My management style is extremely high trust with leaders, and so I try to hire really, really great people, and then I say, hey, I'm trusting you to tell me if something's off, and we're going to stay in very regular sync, and I'm going to apply pressure in certain points, and I'm going to get involved in certain points. But in general, I'm not going to micromanage you, and I'm going to trust you to go crush it. And so that's, there's all sorts of other management styles, but that's my management style. And so it requires people that are very autonomous and I can trust to go, nail these things. And so I'm generally looking for not classic undiscovered talent for those roles.
Yeah, we're running out of time. So I basically only got time for my 3 normal closing questions, which is very unfortunate because I had so many topics here that were super rich that I think we could have got off on. So I'll just bookmark for the next time we do this because I have a feeling you'll be like my equivalent of Tim Ferriss's Kevin Rose on this show. So I had down our roles as fathers and husbands, obviously, our shared belief system rooted in Christianity, some of the things that you've done to set up your personal life for success, whether it's like endowing your life, that concept of endowing your like fundamental expenses, or building a budget and living situation that allows you to be kind of like the equivalent of low OPEX in your life so that you can have high upside in the other ways you use money. Both of our battles with depression and or anxiety over time and how we've coped with that, health and optimizing, food and that kind of thing. So like there's so much rich ground there, that we talk about we talk every day. So it's like we have infinite things we could get into. So I'm really bummed we won't get there. We'll save it for next time. So my 3 closing questions are this. First of all, I find that for me at least, and for most guests who have come on the show too, there's always a question that it's like you wish you could answer. It's that thing that no one ever gets to, that it's like, man, I really wish they would have let me talk about this thing. So I wonder if there's a question you wish that people like me would ask you that you'd like to answer now.
I'm surprised that more people don't ask me about it, but it's some version of how, and maybe it's because it's less contrarian now. It used to be more contrarian, but my wife and I made the conscious decision to have kids very young. So we had our oldest when we were 25, and we have our third on the way. I think it is possible to work insanely hard and be maniacally committed to a vision like Primer and also be a great dad. I don't think those things are at odds. Time is zero sum for sure. But I think that's an interesting thread that people don't talk about enough in general, and generally people don't ask me about. That probably would be the one.
I think we've both had these deep thoughts about our roles in life and the different roles that we occupy. And we're both heavily driven by a desire to make an impact in the world and for that to be positive. And I think we both have a deep understanding that doing that, in the world, but not at home, is in a way empty. For me, at least, the greatest form of leadership is to lead my sons, to teach them to be whole humans aligned to themselves long-term, to be positive contributions or positive contributors to the world around them. When I read biographies, it's like I always look up at my shelves on these interviews and YouTube watchers will probably get tired of it. But, I look up at the biographies, especially Elon Musk, Paul Newman, even Churchill. There are not universal examples of this. Our president, John F. Kennedy, like these people tore apart their personal lives to do what they've done in the world, absolutely destroyed them. Either they weren't present as parents, fathers, they tore apart their marriages. It was just like a path of destruction behind them in their personal lives, but they added a lot of value to society. And we've had this conversation over text. It's like, what do you do with that? Is that the only path, or is there something else available? I mean, even look at Jeff Bezos, or like there's people currently doing it that are like, golly, man, I don't know if I want to pay that cost. So I just wonder how you think about that. Like, because like I see you trying, and we're both trying. We're trying to encourage each other to like do both, to both be a good father and husband and go make an impact. And like, I just wonder how you're thinking about the balance there.
I mean, two things come to mind. One is I think you have to approach your role as a father, in my case, and a husband, with the same level of maniacal focus and drive as you do the company you're building. It's going to require a lot of sacrifice. And so for me, that means I have no my hobbies are building primer and doing things with my kids, and being a husband and a father, and a few other very small things. But I haven't played a video game in my adult life. I don't spend any time doing stuff like that. Every minute is allocated basically, and that's intentional. That's what I chose. And I think that is my view is that it's the only path if you want to try to go take huge swings professionally and try to change the world and build these very ambitious companies, and you want to be a present father and a present husband. You don't have a choice. And so, I make breakfast for my kids every single day, and my wife. I wake up, I work for about an hour, and then I make breakfast for them, and we have breakfast together, and then I head out the door. But that's true every single day, and that's basically a non-negotiable. It's probably when I'm in town, it's 99% of days that happens. And there's just decisions you can make about how you structure your life and the sacrifices you're willing to make. And for me, it's 8 hours of sleep every night. It's basically relentless prioritization of my time between primer and my family and other commitments, but mostly those two. And it's just being willing to say no to everything else. And so that's one big piece of it. And the other piece of it is, do you believe in some, do you have a belief in something that's bigger than yourself? And for me, that's religion, that's Christianity, but there's other versions of that. And if you do, I think that's grounding, it's grounding and focusing in a way that is, I think would not be possible, and would maybe not, you would not be incentivized, or you would not have the desire to, engage in these trade-offs in the same way. And then the last thing I would say about it is just, I think I have a lot of friends who waited till they were much older to have kids. They were extremely successful, and they were sort of, post-economic, post-professional, not really working full-time, sort of just dabbling, investing, whatever, when they started having kids. And that's going to be their kids' entire life. And there's part of that that's very attractive. You have very, very low stress. You get to spend a ton of time together, but their kids are always going to know their parents as people who weren't working, who, kind of already made it. And that's a very different childhood. And, my kids, we have very open conversations with my kids about, why I'm choosing to work as hard as I am, the things that I miss. I'll go on a work trip and I'll miss a soccer game, and I'll talk to my kids about that. And they'll say, that makes me really sad. And I'll say, it makes me sad too. Here's why I'm doing it. I'm choosing to miss your soccer game. Like, that's a choice I'm making, and here's why I'm doing it. And here's what Primer does. And they know about the kids, and they know about the schools. And so I think that's actually a very healthy thing for them to see modeled, that there are sacrifices that we make in life, and time is zero sum. And so, there's going to be trade-offs, but my hope is that when my kids are 25 and we're hanging out, they can say, you know what, like, you invested a ton in us. We have a great relationship with you. We always felt like we were a priority. And we felt like the things that you were prioritizing above us at moments, to not be at the soccer game, but to go, were worthy causes. And we're proud of the work that you did, and the things that you were doing when you weren't at home for those 2 nights or whatever. And so I just think like the idea that you can kind of, that it's not trade-offs or it's not zero sum is sort of delusional. And it comes back to kind of taking kids seriously, like being willing to have those conversations with your kids. And obviously, I don't know what they'll be like at 25, but at least so far, they seem to really understand, and they seem to have internalized that. And I'm hopeful that will be something they'll look back on, fondly, that these trade-offs were very calculated, and that I still was extremely present when I was there. But then also when I wasn't, I was doing something that was, worthy of not being there.
Yeah. And I think just the openness, I think that is the gift that especially our generation and maybe your parents did it, my parents not so much growing up, having the conversation, and maybe they'll be mad at you at 25, but at least you can have the conversation and then just say it. It's like, man, it makes me really angry you miss like half my soccer games. And it's not half their soccer games, right? It's like once every however often, but then fine, they can tell you, and they know they can tell you because you've always talked about it. And that's a gift in and of itself.
What I actually think about the most is that you're hoping that they are going to make these same trade-offs someday. I hope that they choose to have kids and they are pursuing extremely ambitious things in their professional life. And I hope that when they're making those trade-offs, they view, the way that I made decisions not as perfect, not as, the end all be all of how these trade-offs work, but it's a reasonable jumping off point for them to say, you know what, like this is a pretty good framework and I'm going to tweak it here and tweak it there. But like, I feel like I actually had a pretty good example of this. And now I have the language to talk to my kids about it and be honest about it. So it's not perfect, but I have a lot of confidence in how we're handling that as a family. And I think it's working.
Yeah. And it comes back to this idea of like, can we create situations where our kids don't feel the need to swing the pendulum so far the other way? It's like, yeah, they're going to correct for things that they felt like we didn't do right. And that's great. I hope that that's the case. It means they have high agency lives. But if we can minimize, like the wide swing back and forth, I think that's about as good as you can do. I have a 4-year-old and a 2-year-old, and that's the best I got for right now. Okay, my second to last question is, it's about the futures that we're trying to build. And I think for us, we're both ambitious and hopeful, and like we look to the future with positivity. But for a lot of people, hope is hard because it requires vulnerability. It requires this possibility that we might not get what we're hoping for. That makes it difficult to like say the thing out loud. Here's what I actually hope to be creating. So I wonder for you, through your work, and just like generally for humanity, like what is the most beautiful version of the future that you hope that we're creating or that you're creating through your work, in whatever kind of scope you want to share it?
At the meta or like societal level, it would be the greatest form of success I could imagine would be for Primer would be that an order of magnitude more kids. Think about the number of students and kids that grow up and when they're 23, they are high agency individuals who are extremely ambitious, who feel set up to reach their potential and want to take big swings. Whether that big swing is starting a small business in their town and serving their town really well and, being an awesome small business owner, or if it's going on, figuring out how to do some new novel molecular biology research to create breakthroughs that didn't exist previously. They feel set up for that in a way that allows them to have the confidence to chase that and take risks and operate in that sort of high agency, high ambition world. If an order of magnitude more kids were in that position at 23, that would be the highest form of success for Primer, which would require, millions of kids going through the Primer system and infrastructure. And then not only that, but then Primer actually bending the outcomes in such a way that you had 10 times more kids that were in that position. On a like specific level, what I talk to my wife about all the time is that, I hope that 50 years from now, like the greatest joy that I would have is if, I was getting notes from Primer, people that went through Primer and they went through them for a K through 12. And now they're, whether it's a small business owner in their town or they're a US senator or they're running for president or they're doing research at MIT or whatever it is. And they say like, you know what, Primer did shift the curve a little bit for me. Like it made me 10% more ambitious or 10% more creative or, 10% higher agency. And knowing that we bent the curve, even in some small way for those kids and getting that feedback loop of like, hey, you actually really did make this huge impact on me. Or even small impact, but that small impact was enough to, meaningfully shift the direction of my life. That would be more fulfilling for me than any other sign of success that I can imagine for Primer. And I think it would be proof that we had the impact, on the world that we want to have. And so that'd be maybe this specific, kind of anecdotal thing that I would think about as an answer to the question. And then the first part would be more the societal level meta answer.
I love that. It's like the healthcare equivalent of this is the quality adjusted life years. And the earlier you can intervene, the more of those you get. This is the education equivalent. It's like the earlier you can intervene, the more quality outputs you get from that, whether it's just life satisfaction or whether it's positive societal impact. Feel that right here in the heart, which I said with like such a downward tone, but I actually mean I feel that in the heart, and I feel lame saying it, but I feel that in the heart is actually what I mean. So my last question is always in this moment, it's like all of these things have shaped you. All these ways of thinking have helped you get to this point. And this beautiful thing about even highly successful people is we're always becoming someone else. And so I wonder, like, from where you sit right now, who you see yourself becoming at the moment.
Should have given me a heads up on these questions. Jeez. I'll go with a personal one, which is we're our third kid on the way. My oldest is 6 now, and around like 5 and 6, kids become more. They start functioning more like full human beings. You know, they're much more capable of engaging in complex topics and understanding what's going on. And my daughter, who's 3, is also, you know, rapidly approaching that phase. And I think it creates a very different, there's a lot of different family dynamics, a very different parenting, just like posture, I think, in terms of how you bring them in on things and help make decisions. And so my wife and I are spending a lot of time thinking about and sort of trying to plan for and be intentional about that shift in that season. How do you bring your kids into, decisions that you're making or plans as a family while still, ensuring they understand, like, hey, you don't call the shots around here. Like, we are the Delk family. You have joined this family. When you were born, we're so glad that you're here. You're part of this family, but like, you are not, the world doesn't revolve around you. You're not the center of the universe. But still you have agency and we care what you think. And so there's just a lot of, there's bigger picture, questions that I think about with that. And then there's also all the small, like, daily interactions. And I think as a father and as a husband, I want to, approach that shift intentionally. What my oldest asks a lot more questions about, what I'm doing at work, or what's hard, or, I'll be raising money and they'll ask me how fundraising's going and, how much money I raised, or, all sorts of things like that. And just thinking about how to engage and bring him in on things in a way that's not, just being extremely intentional about that, and not just kind of like letting this transition, sort of the inertia, just carry us through, because this is a really different season. I bought a small software company that him and I are going to start kind of like running together. It's like a tiny little, just small little side project thing. And that's like a small example of, of something that I'm trying to do that, I think as he enters this season, I think in this sort of new phase of life, I think can create a lot more intentionality and opportunity for him to engage with things that he couldn't before. But just thinking through more things like that, I think like the clearest articulation is just not letting the current inertia of parenthood and the busyness and all the priorities just carry us into this new season, but actually sort of viewing this as, wow, this is actually a totally new way that we can engage with our kids, an opportunity for creating connection and experiences for them. And how do we be intentional about what this next phase looks like?
Great note to end on, Ryan. I love you, number one. I'm really proud of you. I think that what you're building is one of the most important things that you could possibly be working on. Education, as you said, is upstream of almost everything else that we want that's good in the world. My hope for you is that you just continue not just giving other people gifts of companies or, whether it's your kids or whatever, but that you receive them as well. That you are surrounded by people, support system, and team, family that pours back into you the way you pour into all the things that you work on, because you pour a hell of a lot into the world. So I'm grateful for you. And thanks for joining me.
Thanks, man. It's an honor. Hopefully the first of many.
Yep, for sure.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Good Work. I'm your host and the creator of this show, Barrett Brooks, and the show is produced by my friends over at Podcast Royale. If you enjoyed this episode, please make sure to hit subscribe or follow wherever you get your podcasts, whether it's Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or somewhere else entirely. My guest today was Ryan Delk. Ryan's the founder of a company called Primer, which you can find at primer.com. He's also a great follow on Twitter. You can follow him there at Delk, D-E-L-K. And actually, my guest from last week, Packy McCormick, has an incredible deep dive write-up on the business behind Primer and what they're looking to do on notboring.co. So if you just search notboring.co plus Primer in your favorite search engine, you'll be able to find that essay, and we'll also include it in the show notes. As always, you can find key takeaways from the episode, quotes, clips, and links for everything that we talked about with Ryan at goodworkshow.com. You can also find all past episodes and the show notes for those as well there. If you really enjoyed this episode with Ryan in particular, I'd love you to copy the link from it and maybe send a text or an email to a friend who you in particular think would enjoy it. The reality is that podcasts grow one-to-one, word of mouth, over time, very slowly. So I'd love your help helping to grow the audience. If you're feeling extra generous, leaving a review or leaving a comment on YouTube is always great as well. So thank you for that if you've already done it, and please go do it if you haven't yet. Thanks again for tuning in to today's show. My guest next week is a founder named Julia DeWall. She was Packy McCormick's partner on the podcast that they made called Age of Miracles about nuclear power and where that's going in the future and where it's been in the past. She's also the founder of a new nuclear energy company working to bring more reactors online in support of the many needs of the American economy and government. I think you'll enjoy that episode with her. It's a really dynamic topic, and it's something that I'm very excited about to cover with her. So please tune into that one, and I look forward to seeing you there.